It's been snowing for 6 days. You haven't seen blue sky since the second day. There's no calendar telling you how many are left. No phone to check, no book you haven't already read 4 times. No neighbor to complain to who isn't already sitting 3 feet away. Listen to you complain for the third time this week. No Netflix, no podcast, no scroll to lose an hour or two. Just you, 7 other people, a fire that needs feeding every 20 minutes, and roughly 5 more months of this. You are not going to die of cold. The fireworks, the hides work. You've done this before, and so did the people who taught you how. The thing that's actually going to test you this winter isn't the weather. It's not the wolves outside either, or the thinning food stores you've already rationed twice. It's the 7th person's laugh, which you have now heard for the 400th time this month, and the 8 hours of darkness stretching out ahead of you with absolutely nothing in them that has to be done. It's the boredom. And here's the question almost nobody asks about the Ice Age. If starving and freezing weren't the only threats, what did people who'd already handled shelter and food and fire actually do with the empty hours? What did they do with all that time? The honest answer might be the most important thing you learn about your ancestors all year. Because the evidence suggests that boredom, dead time, the sheer need to fill the hours, may have been one of the forces that built human culture itself. Start with the assumption almost everyone carries into this question, because it's wrong. The picture in your head is probably something like constant desperate labor, every waking hour spent hunting, gathering, freezing, surviving. No time left over for anything as soft as boredom. In 1968, an anthropologist named Marshall Salins looked at real-time use data from hunting and gathering societies, groups like the Juhansi of the Kalahari and the Hadza of Tanzania, and reached a conclusion that stunned the field. He called it the original affluent society. Based on fieldwork estimates at the time, adults were meeting their basic needs in roughly 15 to 20 hours of actual subsistence work a week. Some later studies of the Hadza during the dry season found daily foraging time under 3 hours a day for some groups. That is not a species living every second on the edge of starvation. That's closer to a part-time job. Now, to be fair, this isn't a settled argument. You should know that going in. Later researchers, including Richard Lee himself, pointed out that Salin's original numbers left out food processing, tool repair, and childcare, and that once you add those back in, the work week looks considerably longer. Anthropologists have been arguing about the real number for over 50 years, and they still are. But even the more conservative revised estimates don't erase the basic finding. Hunter-gatherer life had real stretches of unstructured time in it. Not desperate time, empty time. And here's the detail that should stick with you. The anthropologist James Woodburn, who spent years living with and studying the Hadza, wrote that Hadza men seem much more concerned with games of chance than with chances of game. During the long dry season, some men spent entire days gambling and occasionally lost the very arrows they needed for their next hunt in the process. Read that again. Some of your ancestors weren't hunting. They were gambling away their hunting equipment because they were bored. So if the days weren't always a desperate scramble, what filled the gap? Start with the simplest, cheapest form of entertainment there is, talking. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who had spent 40 years studying the Juhansi Bushmen of the Kalahari, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that recorded and compared what people actually talked about during the day versus after dark around the fire. The difference was stark. Daytime conversation was almost entirely practical, where the food is, who owes who what, logistics, complaints, economics. Firelight conversation was different. Over 80% of it was stories, not chores, not planning. Stories about past hunts, about marriages, about disputes, about distant relatives, often woven with music and a little performance thrown in. Wiesner's argument, backed by the primatologist Robin Dunbar, is that once early humans controlled fire regularly, sometime after around 400,000 years ago, it didn't just cook their food and keep predators away. It extended the day by 3 or 4 usable hours that couldn't be spent on foraging anyway, because it was dark. Those hours had to be filled with something. And what filled them, night after night, for hundreds of thousands of years, was narrative. Killing time by the fire may be one of the oldest continuous human habits there is. You've done a version of it yourself. Probably this week, you just called it a group chat, or a Netflix episode, or catching someone up on your day. Storytelling doesn't fossilize. Words don't leave artifacts. But some ways of filling dead time do, and one of them is almost unbearably specific. In 2008, archaeologist Nicholas Kennard and his team, excavating a cave called Hohlfels in southern Germany, pulled 12 small fragments of bone out of the ground. Pieced together, they formed a flute carved from the hollow wing bone of a griffin vulture, about 22 centimeters long, with 5 carefully spaced finger holes and a notched mouthpiece. Radiocarbon dating put it at somewhere between 40,000 and 43,000 years old, making it, along with a handful of ivory flutes found nearby, the oldest known musical instrument on Earth. Whoever made that flute didn't need it. You cannot eat a flute. It doesn't keep you warm. It solves no survival problem at all. Someone spent real time and real skill. The holes are evenly spaced. The mouthpiece is carefully shaped. This was clearly not a first attempt, building an object whose only function was sound. And in that same layer of that same cave, Conard's team found something else. Fragments of an ivory carving now known as the oldest confirmed sculpture of a human figure anywhere in the world. Music and art at the same site in the same few thousand years. Two completely different ways of using time that wasn't spoken for. Which brings us to the paintings. Deep inside caves like Chauvet in France, art dated to somewhere around 30,000 to 36,000 years old, and Lascaux, roughly 17,000 years old, early humans crawled, sometimes hundreds of meters, into total darkness carrying nothing but crude lamps to paint horses, lions, and mammoths on walls no daylight has ever reached. Archaeologists still debate exactly why. Some of it was almost certainly ritual, spiritual, ceremonial, tied to hunting magic or belief systems we can only guess at from the outside. But ritual and boredom filling aren't opposites. Both explanations point to the same underlying fact. Somebody had unclaimed hours, a fire, or a lamp burning fat they'd have to work to replace, and instead of resting in silence, they made something. Whatever the deeper motive, the immediate behavior is the same behavior you'd recognize in a kid doodling through a boring class, or an adult filling a long flight with a sketchbook. Idle hands reaching for something to do, at a scale we can still walk into and stand inside today. Now, a fair question to ask here, how much of this can we actually know, versus how much are we filling in? Be honest about the limits. We can date a flute. We can date a painted wall. We cannot date a feeling. Nobody excavates boredom directly, you infer it carefully from the gap between what an object was for and the fact that someone built it anyway. That's a reasonable inference, not a certainty. And the ethnographic evidence, the Juhansi, the Hadza, comes from people living today or in the 20th century, not from Ice Age Europe itself. Anthropologists use it as the closest living analogy we have to hunter-gatherer life, not as direct proof of what a specific person in a specific cave 40,000 years ago was thinking. It's the best evidence available. It is not a time machine. This is exactly why the debate over Salin's numbers from earlier in this video matters more than it might have seemed at the time. When two respected researchers can look at the same Juhansi data and land on genuinely different weekly hour counts, that's not a sign the whole field is guessing randomly. It's a sign of how carefully this kind of evidence has to be handled. A flute you can hold in your hand and measure. A feeling of restlessness passed down through nobody's written record is a different kind of fact entirely, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. That gap between what we can prove and what we can reasonably infer is exactly where most of this video actually lives. And it's worth sitting with that honestly instead of pretending otherwise. One more axis, and this one comes with an honest asterisk. If you want physical proof that humans built objects purely to play, the oldest confirmed set we have doesn't come from the Ice Age at all. In 2013, archaeologist Haluk Salim Timur and his team, excavating a burial mound called Bashir Hoyuk in southeastern Turkey, uncovered 49 small carved stone tokens, shaped like pigs, dogs, pyramids, and simple geometric forms, painted in red, green, blue, black, and white, along with dice buried together in a single cluster. They date to roughly 3,100 to 2,900 BCE. That's about 5,000 years old, remarkable, but thousands of years after the Ice Age hunters this channel usually covers, in an early farming society, not a mammoth steppe hunting band. So why mention it at all? Because it draws the boundary of what we can actually prove. We have solid physical evidence of dedicated game pieces going back 5,000 years. We have gambling behavior documented ethnographically in hunter-gatherers today. Somewhere in the tens of thousands of years between the flute at Holfels and the dice at Bashir Hoyuk, the impulse to play almost certainly existed too, carved into wood, knotted into string, drawn in sand, none of which survives. We just can't put our hands on it. The absence of an object is not the absence of the instinct behind it. There's one more source of empty hours that's easy to miss entirely, because it doesn't happen in daylight and it doesn't leave a single artifact behind. The winter night itself. In the modern world, we sleep in one solid block and call anything else insomnia. That block is not the historical default, the historian A. Roger E. Kirch spent over a decade combing through diaries, court records, and medical texts from pre-industrial Europe and found hundreds of casual references to something called first sleep and second sleep, two distinct blocks of rest, separated by an hour or two of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. People use that gap for all kinds of ordinary things. Talking with a bed partner, tending a fire, praying, turning over a dream, sometimes just lying in the dark thinking. E. Kirch's argument, published in 2001, is that this two-part sleep pattern was likely the ordinary human rhythm for most of our history, only flattened into one continuous block after artificial lighting made staying up worthwhile and getting up easy. Winter is exactly when that middle-of-the-night gap would have mattered most. A night that's 16 hours long doesn't fill itself with sleep alone, no matter how tired you are. Somewhere in that extra darkness, awake, with nothing urgent to do and no light to do it by, is another version of the exact same problem this whole video is about: dead time, waiting to be filled by talk or memory or nothing at all. There's an even quieter way early humans likely spent unclaimed hours, and it comes from watching our closest living relatives. Among primates, grooming, picking through fur, removing parasites, running fingers over skin takes up a startling amount of the day. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar, the same researcher who helped explain what firelight added to the human day, has argued for decades that grooming is really a bonding technology. It feels good, it builds trust, and it can occupy a group for a large chunk of their waking hours with essentially no material payoff at all. Human groups almost certainly kept some version of this. Physical touch, delousing, braiding hair, sitting close by the fire, right alongside talk and story. It doesn't need a flute or a painted wall to leave a trace of intention behind. It only needs two people, some idle time, and a reason to sit close together through a long, cold night. Quiet, unglamorous, and almost certainly one of the single most common ways an Ice Age winter evening actually got spent. Which brings all of it back to the same fire. The Juhansi telling stories deep into the Kalahari night while the day's work sits finished. A pair of hands in a German cave, 40,000 years ago, carving 5 holes into a vulture's wing bone for no reason an animal would ever need. Someone else in the same cave, in the same stretch of time, shaping a woman's figure out of ivory. A line of painters crawling past the reach of daylight into Chauvet and Lascaux to leave horses and lions on stone no one would see, again for millennia. A Hadza man, thousands of years later and thousands of miles away, laughing off the loss of his best arrows over a game he couldn't stop playing. Stone pieces shaped like pigs and pyramids, buried together in Turkey, waiting 5,000 years for someone to wonder what game they were part of. Two people, wide awake in the dark hour between first sleep and second, talking about nothing urgent at all. And somewhere behind every one of those moments, hands moving slowly through someone else's hair by firelight, with absolutely nowhere else to be. So how did ancient humans kill time in winter? The honest answer is that we can only see the objects that happen to survive: a flute, a painted wall, a handful of carved stones, and we're reconstructing the rest from people living today, whose lives rhyme with the deep past without being proof of it. What we can say with real confidence is that the moment survival stopped consuming every waking hour, something in the human mind didn't just rest. It reached for a story, an instrument, a wall to paint, a game to lose an arrow over. Maybe that's the real thread running under all of it. Not that they were like us, but that the itch to fill an empty hour with something other than silence might be one of the oldest, steadiest habits our species has ever had. You've felt it yourself, probably today. They just answered it with a flute carved from a vulture's wing, and a fire that turned an ordinary night into the first place anyone ever heard a sauterie.